is rapidly reshaping the terrain of security governance, counterterrorism discourses, and knowledge production. From the predictive policing and algorithmic risk assessment to biometric surveillance and to content moderation, AI is increasingly positioned as a kind of a neutral, efficient, objective solution to the problem of terrorism. Yet, as critical terrorism studies reminds us, terrorism is never merely a technical problem to be solved. Rather, it is a deeply political, social, and a discursive construct. This session try to interrogate not only what AI does in counterterrorism, but how it reconfigures power, knowledge, and authority. Critical terrorism studies urges skepticism towards claims of technological neutrality. Algorithms are trained on historical data, embedded in institutional logics, and shaped by prevailing security imaginaries. As such, AI systems often reproduce existing biases related to race, religion, geography, and political descent. And the risk is that AI becomes a tool that automates suspicion, expands preemptive governance, and normalizes exceptional measures, particularly against already marginalized communities. To take us deeper into these conversations, we have invited an expert on critical terrorism studies, Associate Professor Alice Martini. Dr. Alice is a lecturer at international relations at Department of International Relations and Global History, Universidad Complutense de Madrid,
Yes.
Spain. I hope that I pronounced correctly. She also teaches security studies, international political economy, and international relations theory for Queen Mary University of London online program. Her research focuses on international relations theory, particularly critical and post-colonial approaches, with a specialization in international terrorism in the Middle East and North African region. She is the author of 3 interesting and important books. The book that she published from her PhD thesis is The UN and Counterterrorism: Global Hegemonies, Power and Identities, published with Routledge in 2021. And at the next publication, The Contemporary Reflections on Critical Terrorism Study. Editor, he published a book on Encountering Extremism, Theoretical Issues and Local Challenges. This is with Manchester University Press in 2021. And recently, she published a fascinating paper I recommend everyone here to read on critical terrorism studies research agenda for AI, terrorism, and counterterrorism. I think she'll be talking based on this paper. And so thank you, Dr. Alice, for accepting our invitation to join with us today, join in today's webinar. And there is a few words about the structure of the program before I pass the floor to the Dr. Alice. The speaker will share his ideas roughly 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for Q&A session. And the participants can ask either by unmuting themselves or writing the questions in the chat box. Either way, we can direct the questions to the speaker. And so with that note, without further ado, I would like to invite again Dr. Alice. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Faust. As you were just saying, I did prepare a PowerPoint, as you kindly asked me. The thing is that I'm not allowed to share it. So...
Okay. I will make you.
Thank you. Let me actually find it too.
Now I think you can. Yeah.
Okay, let me try. Sorry, just a second. I think it's working. It's just it's not seeing the PowerPoint. Okay, yes, I think now you should be able to see it.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, yes, brilliant. Sorry, I actually put it in a PDF so that
no
I can
problem.
also see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. I was very, very happy and flattered when I received your email some months ago, because it was a big honor for me, to be invited by a program like yours, a university or an institution like yours, and also because it's very an exciting opportunity for me to be here and to exchange knowledge and thoughts on these very important matters, but that it is true that I'm just starting to think of starting to analyze from CTS. So I'm super excited of being here, and I'm very, very happy to meet you, Dr. Faust. We've been in touch by email, but it's really nice to be in the same place, even if it's just virtually. And so again, thank you so much for having me. Sorry again about the delay in the starting of the lecture, and I'll try to keep it at, as you said, 30-35 minutes maximum, because I'm also really looking forward, to share ideas on this. So based on what you told me and you asked me by email, I prepared a presentation that it's about many different things at the same time, but that I think that it could allow us to go into the topic, first of all, of critical security studies, and then critical terrorism studies. And then I am working on some specific lines of research, but it is true that what I prepared for today is it's more general ideas or general research lines, exactly based on the paper that you were mentioning. So I am working on some of these things specifically, but I also want to, just put on the table different ideas and different ways of approaching artificial intelligence from these different approaches, different theories, and so on. I also want to say that obviously some of these things are my own work, but it's also kind of, things that other people has been doing in the field. So I'm basing my research a lot on science and technology studies, critical security studies, and so on. I think in CTS, this is kindly new, but it is true that, again, I'm drawing and building a lot on people's work in other fields. So I want to acknowledge that, because it is true that if some of you in the audience have, I don't know, reading something about science and technology studies or critical security studies in relation to technology and security, not everything is entirely new. However, as I was saying, so I'll present also my research line, but also wanted to leave on the table some of these ideas that are stronger in other fields, because I think they are interesting for critical terrorism studies. And so I'm not going to repeat myself, because the introduction you had for me was super generous, and it's perfect. It's exactly what I do in my life. Sorry, let me just zoom out a little bit. Yes. It's just that what I wanted to draw on, or why do we have my research here? Because exactly as Professor Faust mentioned, I am going to develop the talk today specifically on this paper that I've been writing. So I have been in the field of CTS for ages now. I'll describe the field a little bit more in a second. But as I was saying, so I am working on the intersection of terrorism, counterterrorism, and artificial intelligence at the moment from a critical perspective. So in terms of, as exactly you were saying, power, knowledge, the construction of a specific technology in a specific way, political construction, social construction, and so on, how it intersects with terrorism and counterterrorism, or discourses on that, because this is what I do. But as I was saying, I'll go to that specifically at some point, but I also wanted to leave some more ideas, some more research lines for CTS, because I think they're interesting. And I think that they may be further researched and investigated from a CTS perspective. So I'll mention some other ideas too, which are based on, again, other theories, other approaches that are developed in other fields, or in subfields that are close to CTS, like critical security studies, and that I think that for CTS could represent a very interesting reflection to exploit, to push further, and so on. And then, so I'm going to start from critical security studies, critical terrorism studies, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And because it is based on their ontologies, on their ways of understanding security, terrorism, counterterrorism, and so on, that then I develop my specific research and what I'm going to be saying about artificial intelligence. So again, this is a very situated research. It's very specifically grounded in critical approaches that look at how discourses construct reality in a specific way, and how discourses are imbricated of power. They are placing us and everything in society within power relations, for example, and how this knowledge reproduces specific ways of understanding both technology and then security, and then how all of this has specific political consequences. So I'm not too close to mainstream approaches to security and terrorism and content terrorism. Again, it's very, very based and grounded in critical literature. And then, as I was saying, I'll go through some ideas that I want to leave on the table about critical approaches and artificial intelligence, always emphasizing more terrorism and counterterrorism because this is what I do. But again, I'll leave some broader ideas too on the table for reflection. The very ground differences, and this is all I'm going to be saying about the differences between traditional critical security studies, are the ways we understand security, terrorism in the critical terrorism studies, and then reality per se, I would say. So more mainstream approaches, or sometimes called orthodox approaches to security studies, are mostly focused on the state, usually focused on the state and very state-centric. And then they are very focused on military threat, on threats that are understood as existing per se in society. So, for example, it's usually the very basic example we give to students is the idea that we can go through the world and see what is a security matter and what is not a security matter, because that just exists out there, so that we can just go around and say, okay, that's a security threat, that's not a security threat, and so on. This is one of the main differences. I'll go to that in a moment, but then that makes traditional security studies usually focus to find solutions to these threats. And again, I just want to say before we delve into the critics that there's absolutely nothing wrong. Obviously, we also work with orthodox security studies and mainstream security studies scholars. It's just that then when we do research, there's different ways of understanding the world and society and then security that we base our research on. So we can work together. We do work together. It's just that sometimes we don't really fit, depending on what we do in terms of theories, in terms of understanding the world. Why? Because on the other way, critical security studies, what they've been proposing for the last, I think, 30 years at least, is to understand security as political and as a social construction. So I'm not going to go back or to go too much into securitization theory, the Copenhagen School, Aberystwyth, Paris School, and also like the more recent schools that have been developed, like the Beirut School, for example, and so on. They obviously, all of these subfields have very specific theories of understanding security, and I'm generalizing a lot here, obviously. But again, it's just for you to see the difference. So on the one hand, there is this understanding that security and threats just exist out there, that they are something that we can just go through the world and see, okay, that exists, that is something that is there, it's a phenomenon. Security is something that is stable, we don't need to question it, it's something objective. On the other hand, as I was saying, critical security studies understands security, threats, and so on as social and political constructions. So it's the results, what we consider security as, for example, securitization theory tells us, but also the Paris School and so on, would be the result of either a discursive construction, either practices, social practices that reproduce that construction, either, for example, as you were saying at the beginning, the intersection of power and knowledge. So the idea that, again, that we have something that exists in the world somehow, a political matter that becomes a matter of security because of this social transformation, which, again, depending on the theory, then would happen in different ways, or we would focus on different ways that this matter is transformed into a security issue. And so this is what the first point here says: security is political and socially constructed. And then, as exactly Professor Faust was saying at the beginning, so we would have all of this focus on discourse, power, exclusion in terms of what is that then security does exactly, what are the results, the consequences of the construction of a matter as a security matter, and then the political consequences of this construction. And then again, so this idea that security produces threats. So the construction of security is a social construction that tell us what is a threat, what is not a threat. Obviously, we are part of the process. It's not something that is unidirectional. It's not something that is decided by one only actor. So this is a social process. And by telling us what is a security threat, what is not a security threat, we also would have very important social consequences in terms of, for example, also telling us who is then that can be considered or should be considered as a security threat, who is not a potential security threat, or what is the security we are thinking of, what does it mean, the security we are imagining, what is the security we are constructing for or for whom, and then who is left out of that security. Sorry, Professor Faust, just to say that if I'm being very basic, you just tell me to go.
Thank you. It is very fine. Perfect.
Yes, okay, sorry, because I wasn't exactly sure, about the level of engagement. So if I'm too repetitive,
perfectly fine, because perfectly fine,
Thank you, Zaki. Okay, so based on this, again, so this idea of security as a social construction, then we would have the development of critical terrorism studies. This is the field where I conduct my research on. I'm very much based and grounded in critical terrorism studies. They are, together with critical security studies, they are fields that are somehow close, but it is true that sometimes we work together, sometimes we are considered as separate subfields, because in the end, they did develop in slightly different ways, and some debates are common debates in both fields, but some others are very specific to, for example, critical security studies, and some others to CTS, critical terrorism studies. However, they do somehow or they are very much grounded in the same ontology, and they do reflect some of the same differences with mainstream views on terrorism, for example, in this case. So again, in this specific case, mainstream terrorism studies or orthodox terrorism studies would be focusing, or scholars in that field will be focusing the research on, for example, how to solve problems linked to terrorism, how to improve counterterrorism, how to respond to certain threats, or how to study terrorist groups, like, for example, tactics, the specific threat they would represent, and then, as I was saying, so solutions, how to better respond to specific threats, and so on. So they are very much close to policy agendas because they are somehow normative in this sense. So they are, again, for example, focused on studying terrorism, terrorist groups, strategies, and so on, with the aim of, for example, improving counterterrorism or the prevention of extremism, and so on and so forth. Again, obviously, this is it's very important work. And from critical terrorism studies, sometimes we do work with more mainstream scholars. Sometimes what we do is slightly different in terms of the ontology, in terms of what we consider that our research should be doing. So very close to critical security studies, what critical terrorism studies does is then the focus on terrorism as a social construction. So put it differently and trying to explain myself, what critical terrorism studies does is to look at political violence and to study the way political violence is labeled differently, understood differently, and then categorized in different ways, and the way these different categories shape our understanding of that specific violence. So they would claim that, for example, in very basic and simplistic terms, we could have the same kind of political violent event, but that event would be then called in different ways, depending on the actor that is perpetrating it, the specific social and historical and socio-political context this event is taking place into, and so on. So what critical terrorism studies look at is the interpretation of political violence, and then what this interpretation does. Because again, for example, if we look at the same kind of violent act, political violent act, the way then we will call it would matter politically. Whether we call it guerrilla, whether we call it terrorism, whether we call it insurgency, or whether we call it war, it's what changes in the end the interpretation of that act, and also what in the end would result in a change of the responses to that act. So this is the very basics of critical terrorism studies. It's again very similar to what critical security studies says. So in this case, we would have the construction of terrorism. So the construction of certain kinds of political violence into terrorism, so being labeled as terrorism as the result of the social construction. Again, then different authors within the field would have different interpretations of how this happens. But the important thing to remember is that this process of labeling, I think they all would agree that depends on who is the actor perpetrating the violence, and then the socio-political context when this labeling happens. So why are we calling a certain kind of violence terrorism, and a similar kind of violence, we call it war, for example. And then what is very important for critical terrorism studies is not just the study of this labeling, but it's mostly the political consequences of these acts. So the way we call political violence implies different ways political violence is understood, different ways we understand political violence. We imagine political violence differently depending on the label, because of different things that are involved in this process, in the social construction. And then very important, again, for critical terrorism studies is the fact that depending on the way we call political violence, we would also implement certain kind of responses. So I would say that this is the first thing that critical terrorism studies does, looking at the imbrication of discourses and power in the construction of political violence as terrorism. Second thing, as I would say, would be looking at how this would then be answered, so counterterrorism. And very importantly here, what we would be reflecting on would be the consequences of counterterrorism in terms of society in general. So what are the consequences of counterterrorism? Obviously, this would depend specifically on what kind of counterterrorism we will be looking at, in what specific context, or who is that we're looking at in terms of who counterterrorism is targeting, and so on, because obviously counterterrorism is a broad term that would imply or would encompass responses from very military responses to very, very social responses, as for example, as in community engagement, construction of resilience, in community resilience, and so on. So we have a very different, very broad spectrum of what counterterrorism is. But basically, as I was saying, CTS, what would also be doing is to look at counterterrorism, again, also as a social construction, because that's also the way society or power decides to respond to certain kind of violence because of different reasons and so on, which I cannot go too much into detail. And then the political consequences of counterterrorism. So, for example, the legitimization of certain kind of military interventions through the construction of a political violence as terrorism that would then imply a legitimization of a military intervention. Or if we look at a more kind of social intervention, for example, the legitimization of the penetration of surveillance or certain kind of community policing, for example, because then what is understood that needs to be done is, for example, the prevention of radicalization in certain groups, in certain social groups, in certain contexts of society, and so on. So obviously this is very much context specific. It's very much a social political reality that we will need to have behind each of these claims that I'm making. And again, so we will really need to focus on, or we will need to contextualize more what kind of counterterrorism is that we're looking at, in what countries, and so on. But again, all of this would imply the scrutinization from CTS of how the responses are legitimated. So how is that a certain kind of counterterrorism is legitimated? How is that it is politically justified to be implemented in that way? And then what CTS also does is to pay attention at the consequences certain kinds of counterterrorism would have. Obviously, in terms of military counterterrorism, we would have very specific consequences. So what is that happens with, again, military interventions, military counterterrorism, and so on. Going towards more social kinds of interventions, we would have, for example, I don't know, possibly the discrimination of some specific groups that could be targeted by specific prevention and preventing strategies, the targeting of and profiling of specific individuals, the extensions, for example, of mass surveillance, of surveillance in certain social spheres like the cybersphere, for example, and so on. So again, we would also then look at the legitimization of security and securitization of certain responses, depending on, again, counterterrorism. I hope this makes sense. So it's been a long talk. Again, all of this would be some of the main goals of CTS, and it really depends on what the author is, what the theoretical framework we're using, and so on. We would have different approaches to how all of this happens. But again, first of all, the labeling of the act, the political consequences of the labeling, and then on the other hand, how counterterrorism is legitimated and the social and socio-political consequences each kind of counterterrorism has. And so, for example, questions of how terrorism is imagined, how counterterrorism is imagined, how all of these processes legitimize a certain kind of interventions. Okay, so this will be somehow the theoretical framework where, again, I was saying I base my research on, and then I'll start going into some of the ideas that I have prepared for you on artificial intelligence, scrutinized from some of the specific fields that I've been mentioning. So the first theory that allows us very much, oh, well, the first theoretical framework, subfield, actually, discipline, that allows us very much to look at technology and science as imbricated with power and knowledge is this field of science and technology studies. Again, this is not a field I really belong to, so I want to make sure that, again, the credit goes to the main authors in the field. Again, this is a field that has been around for maybe 35 years or so. But critical security studies has been engaging with this field for the last, I would say, 15 years or so. And then for CTS, I think it's still a field which we are not engaging too much with. And so what I'm trying to do within CTS is to push forward research on technology based on CTS, STS, sorry, for example. And so this is exactly what Professor Faust was saying at the very beginning. Social science and technology studies look at science and technologies as social enterprises, as social constructions that are somehow imbricated, again, with power, with knowledge, and then that reproduce specific political consequences. They use a very broad variety of terms to study these projections, to study these constructions, but the most famous one, or one of the most famous ones would be this idea of socio-technical imaginaries. So a political constructions, or what they define as a collective visions of desirable futures of technological progress, for example, which would be political constructions produced specifically by state actors, but then nowadays the debate is broader, so maybe also other actors could be producing this kind of collective visions. And what these visions do, so again, all of this is again a social construction, is kind of legitimizing, giving a vision of a specific scientific or technological progress. So specific scientific or technological policies to be implemented, politics to be adopted, and so on. Obviously, all of this, they scrutinize very much in terms of these ideas of where technological progress should be going, how technological development or scientific development should be going. They scrutinize it very much as political projects, as political projects that imply a certain kind of exercise of power, and that in turn also imply a certain kind of social order. So what these desirable futures imply, or what these visions imply of the future, is visions of, for example, a certain kind of technological society, a certain kind of technological progress, a certain kind of safe society, where then again we have certain kind of political consequences that need to be scrutinized. So, for example, safe for whom? Technologically advanced society for whom, with what consequences, what will be the political consequences of these projects, and so on. So again, this is somehow the main idea they have. Again, so social, well, technology and science scrutinized from the point of view similar to CTS and critical security studies, that this is also social constructions where power, knowledge is imbricated, and they basically construct technology in a very specific way that then somehow puts a very specific imaginary of what is going on there forward. And so this is why I put here at the end of the slide why this matters. It's a certain kind of justification of specific policies, of specific politics. So we are somehow, or these social imaginaries are justifying and legitimating the implementation of very specific political projects. But then also very important, they shape the understanding of technology, they shape the understanding of science in very specific ways. And then again, the third point that I was saying is that from this point of view, they would also look at the social consequences that these constructions would have. So again, for example, who is left out of security? What are the consequences of who is left out of technology? What are the consequences of developing technology in these very specific ways, or understanding technology in these very specific ways and not others, and so on and so forth. And this is, again, what science and technology studies have been doing for the last 30, 35 years, maybe a little bit more. Nowadays, they're also analyzing artificial intelligence very strongly. So there's a huge body of literature on that topic. And what then I've been doing in this article that I was showing at the beginning, that Professor Faust recalled at the very beginning, is bringing together critical terrorism studies with science and technology studies and critical security studies. Because as I was saying at the beginning, these other fields have been developing a specific research agenda on technology and nowadays on artificial intelligence, but I think this is still lacking critical terrorism studies, and I think that it's an important reflection for our field. And so, keeping on, some of the ideas that Professor Faust was saying at the very beginning are very important for us. There are different ways of understanding artificial intelligence nowadays, and critical approaches, I would say, are more needed than ever, because the majority of the debates, at least in the countries where I am based at the moment and so on, are very mainstream focused on artificial intelligence. And as you will say, they leave out a very important kind of political reflection that also needs to be done. But anyway, what is that I'm referring to? So that obviously, as we all know, in security, for example, in security governance, also obviously in counterterrorism, the role of artificial intelligence is very much discussed, but it is discussed from very mainstream views. Which, for example, this does not imply that they do not raise, for example, ethical or legal debates or dilemmas in relation to the progress and development of artificial intelligence, but that, as I will say, they leave out some things that for us are important. So, for example, mainstream debates at the moment focus very much on the consequences of developing artificial intelligence, the social consequences, for example, in terms of kind of securitizations, or how artificial intelligence is going to be changing certain kind of security practices, for example, whether it's going to be bringing us towards certain kind of mass surveillance practices, even more than what's implemented nowadays. What is the kind of artificial intelligence that could be implemented in predictive policing, for example, and risk assessment is also something very important. Some of the conversations that are going on are focused on how, for example, to improve artificial intelligence to enhance then risk assessment, for example, in security or in counterterrorism and so on. There's also this discussion that's going on the automatization of border control, where artificial intelligence is used in very, very different practices linked to the control of borders, to the control of flows, basically, of migration flows, of movements of people, and so on. And so all of these debates are focused on, again, how artificial intelligence could change or enhance certain kinds of security practices. It is true that, as I was saying, they do raise some ethical and legal dilemmas. So this is also there. There are also some questions there, for example, about the bias that artificial intelligence could be reproducing and so on. But what science and technology does is scrutinizing all of this from a more critical vision. So what they do is to focus on how artificial intelligence is imagined nowadays, exactly as you were saying at the beginning. So how it is usually depicted as, for example, an inevitable progress that we're all just going to be, all of us, towards it. And there's no questioning on whether further development of artificial intelligence should be happening or not. You know, that certain kinds of certain parts of STS, for example, will be against the further developing of artificial intelligence. And then, so there is this description of inevitability of this development. And then there is also this idea that artificial intelligence would render certain kind of tasks, social tasks in general, but then specifically security tasks, as more efficiently done, objectively done, and then it would somehow enhance security, for example. But what STS does, so science and technology does, is again scrutinizing all of this as a social construction and scrutinizing how these discourses are presenting or constructing and imbricated with power a certain kind of technology in a way, but thus foreclosing other possibilities of understanding, imagining, or even coming close to this technology. So from their point of view, AI is also a discursive turning point. There is a social construction that is happening there, for example, of all of these narratives that I just mentioned. And what STS will then do is, again, question these narratives. Sorry, this stayed open. But also to look at the political consequences.
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, so I'll go fast. And then what else happens? So artificial intelligence as a social and political construct, as Professor Faust was saying at the beginning. So these discourses are also reproducing power. They are formulated by usually powerful actors, but somehow they mobilize society in very specific ways. So we all imagine technology in very specific ways, obviously then depending on the context, the social political context, history, historical moment, and so on. But again, so they are very much imbricated with power relations. So they would be reproducing very specific power relations in society already. And then what they also suggest is that we scrutinize these discourses from the point of view that I was mentioning earlier, so on how these discourses would also not just well, they would impact social life, society, and so on. So what kind of people is, for example, benefiting from the development of certain kind of technology and science, what people, what subgroups, what individuals are left out, how does the development of certain kinds of technology impact society, and so on. I'll try and go fast so I can leave some more ideas on the table. So for example, this is what I'm doing at the moment. This is my own specific research. What I'm doing at the moment is looking at how the future of terrorism is imagined in this very specific moment. I look specifically at the international organizations. So I can generalize a little bit, but I don't want to be too generalistic, because it also depends on the very specific country we're looking at and so on. So I look specific at or international organizations, the UN and so on, and some national narratives here in Spain, for example. So there is this idea that the use of artificial intelligence by terrorist groups, for example, is inevitable, that is just behind the corner, and that we are basically going towards very catastrophic futures, because this will give rise to what I call here hyper-terrorism in very specific ways. But at the moment, the data does not really support this imagination of what is going to be happening within terrorism and the embracing of technology by terrorist groups. So data and science at the moment does not really support this. So what I do in this paper that I'm writing is to look at how even if data does not really support these ideas, there is still this very specific imagined future of AA terrorism that is just behind the corner. And then I'm going very fast, sorry, but I hope this is clearer now that I gave all of the introduction. What this is doing, and this is also the second line of my research at the moment, is legitimizing the implementation now of the digitalization of counterterrorism in very specific ways. So the imagination of a future threat that is maybe, possibly, likely, or we don't know, going to happen, is used to legitimize the current digitalization of security responses of counterterrorism, so the implementation of artificial intelligence in a very wide variety of tasks linked to counterterrorism and security. There is an intersection here, obviously, of the construction of the threat that I just mentioned, but also the construction of artificial intelligence, because as I was saying earlier, so artificial intelligence is narrated as this objective technology, neutral technology, a technology that would render counterterrorism and security more efficient, for example. So the problem is not just the legitimization of all of these digitalization of security practices, but it's also the same problem that I was mentioning in the beginning. Who is then left out of counterterrorism? Whose security are we discussing when we argued that we do need to digitalize counterterrorism for security reasons, for example, against whom, and then what are going to be the social consequences, the social impact of this digitalization of security and counterterrorism. So this is where CTS comes very handy on reflecting about, again, the social impact, marginalization of certain people, racial profiling, impact on society in different ways, and so on. Also in terms, again, of mass surveillance, for example, as I was saying, with all of these different caveats that CTS brings forward. And very briefly, I think I have like 5 minutes. So this is somehow one of the things I was saying. So we are imagining a kind of safe society, zero risk security, all of this automated governance with these narratives that legitimate all of this. But what is obscured is the social impact that all of this has. Also the exclusion, the very important exclusionary practices that this would entail. We are excluding certain people. We're also excluding or reproducing certain power relations within the world in very specific way in the international terms. And then what's also obscured is that all of this is a political choice. So by this narration, what is left out is the idea that maybe this could also be part of a political debate. Maybe this could be scrutinized critically, democratically, and so on and so forth. But this debate is not really happening because of how these narratives project artificial intelligence on the one hand, and then terrorism and counterterrorism on the other hand. And then, so there are other issues. I'll go super fast, I promise, linked to, for example, what does it imply to bring military technology more and more and more into society in this way? I'll leave it here, but militarization is also part of the big question of how all of these technologies are entering more and more the social sphere. We can have, as I was saying, so certain kind of narratives that, importantly, what I'm saying here, foreclose specific debates, democratic scrutiny, or scrutinization of certain political choices that are then not seen as political choices but inevitable. And then obviously it's also reproducing very important power relations in terms of the stratification of the world. And then also very important, again, as I was saying, but from different theoretical frames, what is that the role of technology is doing to security? What is that bringing machines, if you allow me to say so, into, for example, security decisions, counterterrorism decisions, would do to, again, taking security decisions without human control, taking counterterrorism decisions without human eyes, and so on. Also because obviously all of this technological innovation would be reproducing certain kind of biases, certain kind of problems that are already there in society, but they do amplify it very much, as Professor Faust was saying at the beginning. And so I'll leave you with some final reflection. So I don't want to say we should do it or we should not do it. I'm not really saying we should be anti-technology. What I wanted to say with the paper is that all of this is there. It has very important political consequences. Obviously, I focus more on security and counterterrorism, but this is in a wide variety of fields and spheres too. And then that all of these discourses are, again, foreclosing the possibility of imagining different responses, not just to security, but also different ways of developing technology, different ways of relating, of having this relation of power, society, and technology that could, again, maybe happen in different ways. But this is what the discourses are resulting into. And so all of this depolitization, all of these discourses construct a specific path that, for example, for now, it's leaving out, resistant to this path, leaving out other kinds of conversations. Not entirely, they are happening, but they are not there in the core of what is happening within the policy making. I'll leave it, Dr. Faust. I'll go to the final slide just to say thank you for the attention. I hope it was not too fast this first part and too slow the first one.
No issue. Yeah. It's a very fascinating lecture, I think. Very comprehensive. In the audience, we have, different types. Some of us, my colleagues, some of my students. So you covered everyone, I think, in your lecture. So this is time for Q&A session, and also any comments. The floor is open. Anyone can ask. We have just 10 minutes time for the conversations. Anyone here?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dr. Mayor.
Is it okay? Is it clear? Because
Clear.
I'm not sure about my internet connection.
Yeah.
I have a quick one. Thank you so much, Professor Martini. Thank you, doctors. Thank you so much for the sharing. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. Just listening, especially to the last bit of your presentation, it had me thinking about two things, and maybe it'd be nice to hear what you think about it. Number one, I do agree that perhaps the imagining of the future does affect the types of the kinds of things that we accept in the present. I think that's where you're going with it in terms of digitalization and so on. But where my head is at, like what I'm wondering is that is this like a nuclear weapon situation all over again, in that it was a technology that was unknown and presents a grave danger in the way in which it could and would be used. And ultimately, the resolution for that was that we reached a point where there was, presumably mutual sort of, basically no one can win, yeah, mutual destruction. And then the pressing nature of the question went away. So perhaps AI, yeah, as it's developing and as it reaches that sort of zenith of capacity, and whereby then many players will sort of have it. Is that the kind of resolution that perhaps is more realistic in terms of how we imagine the actual threat of it? Like, that's number one. Number two, I was also wondering if, in terms of uh, discipline, right? Particularly CTS and AI. Like, I'm not a technologist per se. Like, I use technology, like I use stuff, but I'm not familiar with. I'm not really like an expert per se. But my concern, oftentimes, when I buy a phone, is like, how quickly will this phone become obsolete? So the question will be, the responses in terms of the field to the question of a particular type of technology, like what is the shelf life for? I mean, is there anything you can say, or maybe you've come across anything that suggests the shelf life of, how long and how much AI will continue, and then how long and how much the understanding and the responses for it, will be around. My thinking is that our fear of things like, previously in the 1990s, I'm not too young, fears of like maybe the internet generally, yeah, that sort of like went away, and then now we have fears about AI and so on and so forth. So maybe just, if you could, like, just these 2 points, because you're probably, I mean, not probably, like, you're really into the field, and then you're familiar with the literature. Is there anything you can say about these 2 points? Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Dr.
Shall
Ali? Yeah, please.
Yeah, shall I answer now? Oh, thank you so much. Super nice to meet you, Professor Halef, and thank you for the questions. I'll try and be brief. I promise, Professor Faust. About the first one, so I think it's the same. It's exactly the same problem. So I think that what I was trying to say is that counterterrorism, for example, it's already originating. It's causing a lot of problems, but now we are very much focused on imagining the future, and we are not solving the current problems that we have, which some of them are at the base, for example, of political violence. So instead of solving current conflicts, obviously I'm thinking specifically of non-state actors because this is what I do, but I think that is also applicable to other kind of conflicts where state actors are involved. So rather of focusing on the current situation we have, solving the problems we have, solving what all of the political consequences that security measures, counterterrorism, and so on imply, cause, which are also the escalation of cycle of violence in all forms, whether it's social violence, whether it's military violence, and so on. This is already happening, and instead of acting there, we're focusing more and more and more on the future, legitimizing more and more and more digitalization with all of the consequences that this has. And it's not just consequences in terms of counterterrorism and security, which I already mentioned, but it's also the consequences in terms of what you were saying. So, for example, the environmental consequences all of this technological development has, the environmental consequences, climate change consequences, the division of or structuring of the world again and again in very specific power relationship implicated with globalization, capitalism, extractivism, and so on. Obviously, this last part is not really my own focus, but I think that it also answers somehow your second questions. For me, it's not really the fear of artificial intelligence, because I also think there's a little bit of maybe ignorance from the wider public, and I'm super included in this. So we think that artificial intelligence for now can do certain kind of things, but at the moment, the experts tell us that it's not really true. What this imagination that we have of it's not really reflected by the real capacities that it has. I think it's going to stay with us, if this is the question. So I'm not very positive about the words abandoning artificial intelligence. But what I wanted to say is, again, so that again, we're focusing on developing a certain kind of of technology, with all of this global race, with this kind of speculations that then we do, for example, in relation to terrorism, counterterrorism, and so on, with very, very specific consequences that are happening at the moment, that are also raising and creating cycles of violence that are very important. And again, in this case, I don't refer specifically only to terrorist groups, but also thinking of extractivism impact that it has, climate change, environmental impact, and so on, for example. So again, maybe the fear will go away at some point. I think digitalization will stay. And I think that the consequences of what we've already been seeing happening in the world, and then in my own specific field, counterterrorism and prevention and so on, are there already, will stay with us, will possibly be aggravated by all of this. And I think we already have a problem. So the point of STS and so on, I think it's one of these points is this. These things are already happening. Political consequences are already here, but we are not really looking at them because we are thinking of the future. And this thinking of the future pushes us towards going towards that in a very specific way, and not really looking at what is happening now and how to solve what is happening. So I try to be brief, Professor Faust.
Yeah. Thank you. Is there any other questions? Any
thank you again for the question, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. I have one question that I'm kind of interested in securitization theory, and you said that AI has become not an actor in the security, imagination, security governance. It's no more a tool rather an actor. Could you reflect on how this would impact on kind of theorizing securitization in the age of AI? Because securitization generally focuses on, if you go to the Copenhagen and then again, even the Paris School, focusing on the actors and the practice. Again, the actors are operating behind the scene. And AI being a key actor in securitizing, producing securitized imaginations and governance. What would be your response in terms of how the theory would shape in the future?
Well, yeah, it's super interesting, Dr. Faust. So this is the place where I'm not too familiar with the literature, but I also find it very fascinating. This part of reelaboration of securitization and security comes from the theory of actor network theory, which you read the paper. So it's something that I mentioned in the paper. So from all of these views that Latour has about materiality, non-human actors embedded within these networks and so on. And I find that it's very pertinent also to the reflection of counterterrorism. Obviously, that's a very philosophical stance that then has been embraced by critical security scholars, for example, like Mark Salter, I think Rocco Bellanova, and all of them use actor network theory. And they use it to think of security. And I think it's super interesting the way they think about it as, again, one of these, one actor within a network of actors producing certain kind of consequences. So, I think that the problem here is when we think of securitization, we obviously usually think of people. I also think of people, right? But I think that their theoretical proposal will be to use this idea of actor. So in this case, we will have different possibilities of what an actor could be, right? So an actor could be, again, a person, different people there and so on, but could also be, in this case, from their understanding, a tool, a technology. And this, in the case of artificial intelligence, I think it's very observable, and it's very visible how it translates security responses. Because, for example, when we implement digitalization of counterterrorism, basically what we are asking the machine is to tell us, for example, to predict who could be a threat to society. So it's reproducing the logics of profiling, for example, and so on, but amplified a lot because obviously of the biases it has. And also at the same time, the knowledge it produces, so the answer it gives us, has an impact on us. So even if the human eye is still there, it is still at least influenced by the answer the machine is giving you. You know, so in this case, it is true that, especially with artificial intelligence, I'm sure other technologies too, but in artificial intelligence, also maybe because it's a technology that, even if it's kind of new, we all interact with in a certain way. And we do see how interacting with the machine, you know, even the very basic system, whether it's the DeepSeek, ChatGPT, or whatever, Claude, Gemini, and so on, we can, I think, see that if we start using it a little bit for just the way it works, it really also, so you start by asking a question, and then you're 10 minutes afterwards, you're like thinking about something different. You're like, okay, but I was asking something different, you know, so it takes you to places because of the way it's structured to work, it's structured to capture you, and so on. So obviously they don't implement ChatGPT in counterterrorism, but it's still, you know, so this is, I think, where we can think of the role of the machine and the way it produces knowledge that then is going to be influencing not just obviously the answer, because sometimes the answers are automated, but it's also going to be interesting the answers that have not been digitalized. Even if we just then look at the information, it's still going to, you know, have an impact on us and so on. So I think that in this sense, actor network theory, it's super interesting to think of this technology and to think of how these networks of security work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr.
No, thank you.
Alice.
Super interesting question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Alice, for your insightful lecture and also your answers. It's thought-provoking, and so it's time to, you know, conclude our session. We have only 2 minutes left for us. So again, thank you, Dr. Alice, for accepting our invitation and sharing your ongoing research. And hopefully, I suggest to my students to read some of your works that you personally send it to me, and it's also available in the Google, which was super interesting. I have been reading for few of your works during in this month and the last, actually, kind of opening up a new paradigm of ideas in terms of how we can reimagine the concepts of security in today's AI world. And so again, I thank you. So and also I would like to thank the participants who joined with us today, and for their questions, engagement, and thoughtful deliberations. And also I would like to thank the head of policy and area studies research unit, Dr. Mior Alif, who is the head, and his team for this wonderful arrangement. And we have another webinar coming up next January. This